So here are 6 key challenges that I'd like to talk about. I can actually talk about them in any order. They're not the only challenges, and I'll leave you with the last slide with a whole bunch more. But I think it's pretty clear for Canadians that we do have to confront arbitrary U.S. trade actions. The penalty tariffs that the Trump administration has slapped on us and threatened to slap on us. But we also need a new sets of trade rules and trade arrangements that benefit workers and not corporations, or the many and not the few. We need to rebalance the sort of ridiculously unbalanced investor rights in these types of agreements, like investor-state dispute settlement, and talk about investor responsibilities. We have to tackle climate change. We've gotten a real warning in the last week from the IPCC. Those of us in developed countries, we have about 10 years, to make a really quite dramatic shift, or we are going to face quite disastrous levels of warming. Respecting food sovereignty, that raises the whole issue. Supply management is very much in the news, but Mexican peasants and corn growers have suffered incredibly under the current model, and that's not going to change because of the USMCA. It's going to be locked in. And the issue that, in a way that's very related, I didn't hear the pharmacare discussion, but this idea of reforming intellectual property rights, because trade agreements have been a way for Big Pharma to increase their monopoly profits through basically, through skewing the legal system to, keep cheaper generic drugs out of the market for longer and longer and longer. And that, again, is the story of the USMCA, unfortunately. And in Mexico, it's gonna make some there are going to be some really extreme consequences, even worse than in Canada. So at this point, where would people like to begin? My partner Rosalind reminded me the last time I came to the CCU, I thought a long time, an hour. I had a very compact presentation, and we opened it up for discussion, and I only got about 20% of the way through. But so, where would people like to begin? We could just start at the top and work our way through, and we'll see how that goes. Because as I said, I would like people to raise their hands and with questions, and not make this just me as a talking head. We have a lot of time, twice as much as I had the last time I was here.
We have a question back here.
Great. Okay, where are we? Go for it.
Can we call it NAFTA II instead of the USMCA? Because I'd rather not call it anything that Donald Trump wants to call it.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I think those of you on Twitter, people are trying to come up with funny ways to pronounce it and funny names for it. But yeah, it's a NAFTA replacement deal that looks a lot like the old NAFTA. There are a few differences that we'll get into. Okay. Just a bit of a review of the NAFTA period. We have had strong growth in trade. We probably would have had that even without NAFTA. It's sort of ridiculous when Brian Mulroney talks about how many jobs have been created in the NAFTA era, as if, economies grow, they create jobs. That's how it works, except during, serious recessions and depressions. But some of the key arguments for NAFTA were that they would increase Canadian productivity and that we would catch up to the United States. And clearly that has not been true. And so here, this slide just shows the productivity gap between Canada and the United States. So labor productivity is basically just economic output per hour worked. And according to all the arguments at the time, the biggest projected gains from free trade were to stem from rising productivity. And
Scott, I just got a comment just on the labor productivity.
yeah,
there's this argument that unions are responsible for inflation, right? But if you go back to the 70s, right? We're productivity in Canada has actually outstripped, inflationary pressure on wages. That's why I always look at, when I see these graphs, I always think this is kind of a trap, arguing about the productivity.
Well,
because the reality is productivity from the 70s in Canada, has increased.
Yeah, it's
far outstripped wage growth.
Yes, no, that's absolutely true, and that's an important point, because and that's actually probably the key point, if we're talking about the Canadian economy, and actually the, large parts of the global economy, is most of the productivity gains since the mid-1980s have been captured by the top 10% and even the top 1% of the world's population. And that is the driver of inequality. In the immediate post-war period, we had an economy where productivity gains were more widely shared. We had very high marginal tax rates on upper income earners, was 90% in the Eisenhower era in the U.S. And we had a lot of public investment, the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, and also many of our policymakers were very conscious of fascism and the cost of the war, and so we had a period of till about the beginning of the 1970s, when productivity gains were more widely shared. Then came Thatcher and Reagan and free trade and deregulation, tax on labor, and we have a system, where we continue to have rising productivity, but the gains are not shared. Now this graph, though, shows is the gap between Canada and the United States, and that it hasn't closed. Because seriously, all the economic studies about the benefits of free trade were premised on the idea that we were going to close, that that's kind of like the cold shower of competition was going to close the productivity gap between Canada and the United States. So free trade has not solved our productivity problem. I see a hand right there.
Yeah, I guess I'm old enough that I went through NAFTA when it came in, and when Labor fought it tooth and nail, we used to have stickers that showed Canada unemployment zone, U.S. banking zone, Mexico job zone. And when Trudeau had the National Development Park, and I can only speak for small town Ontario, there's all these branch plans. The 6 months, and that's why I've never understood why there's still support even in this country around NAFTA. Because we watched in our little town 5-6 plants were gone within 6 weeks or 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the U.S., they didn't necessarily go to Mexico. And that happened all over Ontario. All these plants left, and they didn't come back. Which was a hollowing out of the economy of those jobs. Now we're going through round two, which if you live that, it just feels like you're gonna get boned all over again.
Yeah, I think that. What is a thought that's occurred to me is that we went through that bloodbath really in the early years of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. We lost hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs where you live and other places were hit really hard. we reoriented our economy towards the U.S. market. And the problem now is, like, when you get the threat, really, why the Trump tariffs and the threat to blow up NAFTA was somewhat credible is because we could go through that kind of disruption again in reverse. And again, it's because workers always bear the brunt of these types of restructuring. I think the threats are overblown. You know, at CCPA, we've made a point that yes, Canada actually could have walked away from a bad deal, and we could have managed. But there is some credibility to the threat because you kind of get the shock in reverse because we reoriented so much to the U.S. market that we are dependent, and we are much more dependent on them than they are on us. So what are the benefits of tariff-free access? Well, it allows economies of scale. It allows for cross-border supply chains. The automotive industry is the key one, built by the Auto Pact, which, by the way, was a managed trade agreement, not a free trade agreement. Mobility for executives and professionals. Some people, like nurses, have taken advantage of some of the provisions under NAFTA to work in the United States. But it also enables social dumping, which is basically where you have corporations can put downward pressure on wages, environmental standards, and public protections. And so we have companies like Caterpillar who provoke a strike, and then when they don't get everything they want, they just pull up their stakes and they move to a right-to-work state. They didn't move to Mexico. They moved to Michigan or Indiana. They moved to a right-to-work state. So there are benefits, to building things together, as the Canadian government likes to say. But this system has empowered corporations and the very wealthiest at the expense of others, almost everyone else. So yeah, what could possibly go wrong with a system like this? That seemed to be working so well for the elites. And basically, you get a demagogue like Donald Trump who's able to exploit legitimate grievances for political gain. And I would say he offers fake solutions to real problems. But I think that his attack on NAFTA as the worst trade deal ever, his appeal to communities that had been devastated in the United States, particularly in the Rust Belt, it created a path to the White House for him. And that's now a scary prospect that we have to live with. A big loophole in NAFTA, of course, is that there really never was secure market access to the U.S. And those of you who work in the forestry sector will know this very well. We've had repeated attacks on softwood lumber, and NAFTA really never dealt with that core issue of U.S. trade remedy laws, which are, they're anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws. Now, in addition to that, we now have these national security tariffs. They're very strong national security exemptions in trade agreements, and the Trump, gang decided that this was the best way to proceed, and they slapped 25% tariffs on Canadian and other countries' steel, 10% on our aluminum, and they threatened, and are still threatening, in fact, to put 20% tariffs on autos. And so, you like to say, yeah, bullying tactics can't work, but in fact, they have. U.S. also wanted to eliminate the NAFTA Chapter 19 review process, and the Canadian government saved that. I am not a big fan of this Chapter 19 process. I can talk more about it, but I don't think it really has been very effective. I'll just say, again, for those of you in the softwood, in the forestry sector, it never resolved. The softwood lumber issue. It went on for 4.5 years. We got a bunch of favorable panel rulings, and then we had to negotiate basically a managed trade agreement with the U.S. was the only way to get out of it. So what do we need in this area? Well, we need clear rules to deal with subsidized trade and dumping. Like, nobody wants to see dump products. We have to agree on what sorts of subsidies are legitimate or not. National security tariffs are unacceptable. And, trading partners should be presumed innocent, not guilty. Like now, as soon as you're investigated under a U.S. trade remedy law, you're hit with the preliminary tariffs, even before the case is finished. And that already disrupts your trade. And we have to have a strategy nationally to stand up to Trump's bullying. Now, just to move on, I'll just move on to the second challenge, and then maybe we'll open it up again. So, as we mentioned, because of the question about who gets the productivity gains, the labor share of income in all three countries has fallen. This graph shows the labor share of income in during the NAFTA period. So you can see that, despite the concerns about all these factories moving to Mexico, that Mexican workers actually get a smaller share of, their economic pie, the income in their country, than they did when NAFTA was signed. I mean, Mexican unions have always been, in my lifetime anyway, most, except for a few independent unions, are pretty corrupt and government controlled. But back when NAFTA was signed, Mexico had a pretty thriving, it wasn't that efficient, had a very thriving manufacturing industry that produced mainly for the domestic market. And that was just crushed by NAFTA. And since then, we've seen that their labor share of income. So this chart just measures the amount of income in a country that is captured by workers of all types. And you can see it's fallen in all three countries, but most dramatically in Mexico. How can this be addressed in a better set of trade agreements? Well, there's a lot of emphasis on enforceable labor rights. The ones in the new NAFTA 2.0 are not that enforceable. There are some good provisions in there. We have learned a lot over the years about, mainly by taking complaints that never got anywhere. There's never been a single labor complaint that has been won under any U.S. or Canadian free trade agreement, ever. We need minimum labor standards in free trade areas or in common economic areas, and there will always be disruption from trade. We need really generous labor adjustment and retraining programs. Now, I think I'll stop there and just ask if anyone wants to add something.
Well, the slide before this one.
Yeah, okay.
The graph that you had.
Yeah.
It looked like Canada itself was doing very well in the mid-'80s, according to that graph. What 86? And then we free fall after we signed the agreement.
Yeah.
So what prompted any political party to want to open this up? Was it just a matter of greed?
Well,
corporations?
For the corporations, the goal of corporations, like beginning in that shift. I think it started in the 70s under Thatcher and Reagan and intensified in the 1980s. The goal was to reduce labor share of income. And all the policies, including free trade and cutting taxes, cutting services, which again is another way to sort of reduce people's standard of living by shifting more, work like onto women in particular, or the cost of drugs shifting it. You're paying out of your pocket instead of being covered by the state or being covered collectively. That shift that's not an accident. That is a deliberate policy shift. That's neoliberalism. And and free trade and free trade agreements were a big part of that, but they weren't the only part. It was also, austerity and privatization and all those things. But, this is no accident.
So he hopped on the bus and he went down there, and they used a term there when he got there. So the factories have gone. There was strikes with Wagner. Wagner then pulled up and left. And they had a term, their middle class, they called EDS and MEDS, medical education. And there's a river in town. On the one side of the river is where the middle class was, and the other side of the river is where the rest of the town is. So when the reporter went in and looked at it, so they got ads in the paper. These were $20, $30 an hour jobs in London, Ontario. The production workers were $13.50. The welders were $15. So they went into the local pubs and restaurants and started talking to local people. And what they were saying is, well, this is great. We didn't want your Canadian jobs because we know they're here for 4 or 5 years. If we unionize or we move wages up, they're going to pick up and go somewhere else. So we just see this as a short-term gain. So they weren't even really positive, but what they'd seen, and they talked about, Wagner had like 15,000 employees there or something like that, and all these other, but literally it all left after a series of strikes. And it's quite an interesting article, but the people there don't see it that's going to last either. They'll pick up as soon as they have any kind of wage increases or unionize, they'll go somewhere else. So, but it's a great read, quite frankly, because he talks to the mayor and everything in the article, but pretty sad.
What all Trump has to do is talk about a tariff on auto parts, on the auto industry, and Trudeau collapses, and he kowtows and gives him whatever he wants. What kind of strategy? How do you do that when he's got such a massive stick?
Yeah, I have a degree of sympathy, for Chrystia Freeland and Trudeau, faced with this bullying. I sometimes you hear the answer of, diversification. We have to open other markets and, sign a free trade agreement with Europe or China, God forbid. But I would say, that's just.
You can't even sign a free trade deal with China.
Yeah, because of restrictions in the USMCA. That's right. They have provided a kind of a veto. I would say that we over time do need to become less dependent on the United States. I think we have to move away from these types of agreements. Basically, if I were to go chapter by chapter through the NAFTA or any free trade agreement, what you see are multiple restrictions on the role of government in the economy. Some of them aren't even related to trade. And cash grabs like intellectual property rules, they're just cash grabs for big companies. So if you tie the hands of governments to act, on behalf of the Canadian population, to act in the public or the collective interest, then that's, this is the situation we're going to find ourselves in. And I think even among the Canadian business community now, there is a sense that we have gone too far in this kind of neoliberal direction of locking ourselves in to these kind of multiple restrictions. And and signing the same types of agreements, with other countries that we signed with the United States is not going to solve that. I think we need some policy diversification. We need what we used to call industrial strategy, but now, what we need is a green industrial strategy. And I think, the challenge of addressing climate change is obviously, that is a big challenge, and it's going to take, it's going to create a lot of jobs. It could, if we took it seriously, it would create a lot of jobs, a lot of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the built sector. All those buildings need to be retrofitted to and insulated properly, and everything new has to be built to a higher standard if we're going to meet these challenges. It should take massive public investment, and I think that's justified, given the costs that we now know that are associated with extreme climate change. But again, this model that's kind of locked into trade agreements is not very conducive to it. So I think we need a new model. And you ask me my advice, I wouldn't say go out and try and negotiate this new model. I'd say just do what has to be done and take your lumps. How you stand up to Trump bullying is you do what has to be done, to create a workable economic strategy that shares the benefits and addresses the problems that we care about, like climate change and inequality, and then defend it when not just Trump, but when others, including the corporate sector, attack it. So that's how I would say: do the right thing, and then just don't back down, at least any more than we have. But now I know I'm kind of begging the question. We are vulnerable, I'm not convinced that the Trump administration will impose those auto tariffs, but if they did, it would cause a lot of devastation. But we could even deal with 20% tariffs. It's maybe not as bad as some people say.
Would that not just create inflationary pressures in the U.S. too by increasing the tariffs on auto parts or autos? That's one of the fears they have down there. Of course, is the same fears we have here.
Well, one thing that makes me a skeptic of whether Trump can deliver this is because almost I've looked at, some of the testimony in the hearings that they have to have about these tariffs, and everyone is opposed to it. Well, I think that happens here too, and I'm guessing, again, because labor productivity is just per hours worked, the fact that you work longer kind of would be reflected in those figures on productivity.
Was it per hour?
Yeah, it's just output per hour. Yeah, it's output per hour work. So if you work more, and it wouldn't. Their higher productivity is explained by something else.
Lower wages?
No, it's not wages. It's just your output per hour. It's explained by mainly by technology, I would say, like they and the structure of their economy. They still have more. Their manufacturing sector's been hollowed out, but it's the structure of their economy. They have more high productivity industries than we do. I can't break it down off the top of my head, but no, it's not their low wages. That's another measurement, and it's not them working longer. It's that they still have, and they have a more advanced economy. They do. It's very uneven. It's concentrated in the big urban centers and the Northeast and the South and California and Trump's areas are the Red Belt are the communities that are suffering, but they still have a more productive economy and that's we need that in Canada, but we have to build a different one that's not so brutal and leaves so many people behind.
Yeah, just to answer the brother's question, like I know in our industry, construction, right? Like our American construction workers, are they better tradespeople? Do they work harder than us? None of the above. Do they have higher productivity? Yes. Why do they have higher productivity? It's because American businesses have invested more heavily in technology than Canadian businesses. So we're still using basically the same construction techniques that you did in the 70s. You go down to the States, they've traded equipment for labor. So they have much more high-tech equipment, and that makes the difference. They've invested a lot more. Canadian businesses, especially in construction, really, they're very reluctant to put money into, new formwork systems or new innovation. Like every year we go down to World of Concrete, and it's like the world's largest construction trade show. And, there's the highest tech equipment. And there's a lot of Canadian businesses that go down there, but they don't buy. They're there looking. The American businesses are buying, right? So I know in our industry, that productivity gap is strictly based on them adopting technology way faster than we have.
But yeah, I think the brother makes a good point. I mean, what we really need in a lot of sectors in this country is we need a better business class. We need a better capitalist class, or to take push them aside through public investment and just do things better, because they're laggards. They really are laggards, and they use excuses like, we don't have openness to markets, we have too much red tape. I mean, we've been reducing red tape for 30 years. How much friggin' red tape is there? It's like it's just a sob story. It's just a bunch of complaints. And, I'm getting to the point where, I sit down with these guys and I just say, you guys are getting your heads handed to you. Like, you signed this agreement with the Europeans, their exports are up 12% in the first year and ours are up 3%. So, we got to rethink the way we do things in this country. You've been sitting on your ass and,
Recovery in the oil and gas industry will be a jobless recovery because of tech. There will be installations for contractors, but they're replacing with high tech, and we're seeing the same thing. And Jan's right on. I mean, the Canada Post, the Amazons of the world are coming to Canada. We have a contractor, and that's all they're doing is automation, package automations for Canada Post and these type of things, and they're all about reducing jobs, up productivity for Canada Post, but no people are getting paid wages. Seeing the same thing in the auto industry, where 200 people in the body shop. You go to a tier 1 plant, there's 20, 30 maintenance guys and very few production people. There's actually the first time when I was in a tier 1 plant that I realized they could actually make automobiles without people. They got maintenance staff, but she isn't far from what we call lights off industry production, right? So, but it's going on everywhere.
Amazon just opened a store in New York. No people in it. You walk in, you have an app. Whatever you take, you walk out. It's all checked out. As soon as you get outside the store, they'll send you an email. Here's your bill. It's already charged to your credit card. You spent X amount of time in the store. You spent X amount of time looking at this product or that product. It's all automated. There's not one person in there to help you find stuff, anything at all. Oh yeah, they have the people to go in and restock the shelves at the end of the day. That's it. And that's coming to Canada very, very shortly.
Amazon is the biggest example of it, but the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. Amazon has structured not only replacing people, but they have structured their international operations in a way that they pay very little tax. And so, those types of productivity gains are not that Amazon has had. That type of automation, we're not really, we shouldn't be pursuing. But the challenge is to produce things in the most productive way, to work in the most productive way, but to ensure that the benefits are shared through, reasonable wages, good working conditions, and also a supportive set of public services. Okay, I want to move on to another issue. Have people heard of investor-state dispute settlement in these agreements? Does anybody want to take a stab at talking about how it works? Or, okay, let me ask another question. Has anyone, I don't know how many of you are from this region, have you heard of the Bilcon case? Okay. A few have. Now, the Bilcon case is probably one of the worst of many losses that Canada has suffered under what was called NAFTA Chapter 11. So, investor-state dispute settlement allows a foreign corporation to directly challenge before a private tribunal any government policy or measure or action that essentially harms their investment. Now, an American investor wanted to build a quarry on the Bay of Fundy, and there was a federal provincial environmental assessment. It went on for 2 years. Everyone had the right to participate, including that company, Bilcon, and the foreign investor. And at the end of the day, the environmental assessment panel ruled that the project was harmful and shouldn't go ahead. And the Nova Scotia government and Ottawa agreed, and they didn't give approval. The company had the right to challenge that to the Canadian courts. It didn't. Instead, it went directly to NAFTA, and it won in a split decision, which is just so offensive on so many levels that it really highlights what the problems are with this investor-state dispute settlement. Now, the company's asking for up to $500 million in damages. That hasn't been decided yet. The tribunal is still looking at that. But it's not the only case. We've lost 8 cases or settled cases with damages under NAFTA. Canada has. We've paid out over 200 million so far. That amount's definitely going to rise. And we did a Freedom of Information request about a year ago that revealed we paid up to $95 million in unrecoverable legal costs defending ourselves. That was to the middle of 2017. So there's almost $1 billion being claimed in ongoing cases now. And we've been the most sued country under NAFTA, more so than Mexico or the United States. Now, in terms of how we deal with this, the USMCA, the NAFTA 2.0, actually represents some progress on this issue. It will phase out investor-state dispute settlement between Canada and the United States. Like, incredibly, the Canadian government initially resisted this demand from the United States. And it's very difficult to explain. I have to say, I'm kind of amazed by it. But the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer has a conservative critique of investor-state dispute settlement. He says, "It's not my job to protect you guys when you invest outside our country." And he's talked about the same sorts of things that we talk about, unelected lawyers sitting in judgment on government, in his case, American, elected officials. And he's also talked about the chilling effect. So This is the one positive development in this agreement. So within 3 years, if the agreement's ratified, within 3 years it'll be phased out between Canada and the United States, and there will be a more limited form of investor-state dispute settlement between the United States and Mexico.
Is this the one that, because when they did NAFTA originally, it was people say, or we were told by our leadership that it was all about the water, the long game was about the water, and as long as you sent so much oil down, you couldn't cut the oil back, you sent so much water down, you couldn't cut back. Does this get rid of that?
Well, there are these so-called proportional sharing provisions that covered all goods, including energy. And again, so basically they said that if you were to cut back on your energy exports, if Canada were to cut back on its energy exports to the United States, it would have to maintain the share to the United States that had been in effect over the previous period. It was, I think, 36 months. Those are gone. Again, those are gone, and not just for energy, but they also applied more broadly to other resources, including water, if it had entered into trade, and they're gone. How do we explain this? Well, I mean, again, we are in a bit of a different world where this U.S. administration is flexing its muscles in different ways. They are now exporting energy, which they weren't when the original NAFTA was signed. Like they're exporting, fracked oil, from the Bakken Shale, the stuff that blew up, the town of Lac Megantic. That was U.S. oil being fracked oil being distributed through Canada. So, they may be saying we don't want these restrictions, and Canada also, opposed them. So they're gone. That's another. There's a handful of decent things in this agreement, things that we've argued for a long time on the left. Investor-state dispute settlement. I think that a lot of the campaigning against it had a real impact on public opinion, to the point where when Chrystia Freeland, announced the deal, her government, which has supported it and is still signing agreements that include it, like the so-called Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, was, celebrating it as a huge win for Canada that we've gotten rid of this. So, but this is, one area where I think it's a positive step, and we should take some credit for that. Council of Canadians, for example, has been fighting against it, from the very, very beginning. So I want to move on to the next challenge. Unless there are other questions about investor-state dispute settlement, or
Didn't they move towards that with the Canada-EU trade deal?
yes, and the Canada Pacific, the Pacific Rim, the CPTPP. Yeah, Canada supports investor-state dispute settlement. The Canadian government supports it, despite the fact that we, have been borne the brunt of it. The U.S. has never lost a case. So it is kind of astonishing that that we defend it and they're against it. I think it has a lot to do with Lighthizer. I mean, it's just this kind of, a lot of history is a contingency, right? And he personally objects to the system, and so they went after it.
So they're moving away from the corporate tribunal approach. What approach are they suggesting, or do they have anything?
They're suggesting you have to first go to the domestic courts, which is a good argument. There's never was any problem with the domestic courts in the United States, as far as I can see. Especially for corporations, like they're far better protected. I mean, they have the same access to the U.S. courts as anyone does. I mean, there's no nationality restrictions, and they're far better financed. Like when we go to court, we ever do. I mean, it's just so expensive for individuals. But corporations have deep pockets. They're quite capable of defending themselves in the courts, and that's what they should do. Like the Keystone Pipeline, for example. There was a threat of an investor-state dispute settlement, but they were already in the courts. And if they had an argument, that the Obama administration had, discriminated against them or applied their own laws improperly, they should take that to the courts. Also, there is these government-to-government dispute settlement mechanisms. The truth is they're not really very effective. There's only been 3 of them in the whole history of NAFTA. But yeah, investors are protected in the courts, and if we're worried about investors, like in some developing countries, there are ways that we can protect them through insurance, like private insurance or publicly funded risk insurance. And I want to say, some of the things that Canadian mining firms are doing in other countries and launching investor-state dispute settlements over are pretty shameful. And I don't think it's, I'm with light eyes, so I don't think it's our job, to protect Colombian mining companies in Colombia who are defying. Currently, there's 3 or 4 cases under the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement where the Colombian Constitutional Court has disallowed mining licenses because they're trying to protect wetlands, which are the source of the country's water supply. I mean, that's a good thing, and that's their decision. And we should not be enabling our companies to make those sorts of challenges. Another challenge that is completely neglected, and you can't even say it's inadequately treated in trade agreements. I mean, the USMCA does nothing to, address the issue of climate change. Doesn't even mention it. We have a blog up on our website talking about that now. But it's locking in, a model that is threatening, the viability of the planet, really. And obviously, in any international agreements that Canada signs now, we need ambitious binding targets for greenhouse gas emissions. We need something, I call it a safe harbor, or others have called it a safe harbor, but it's basically, if a measure is taken in good faith to address climate change, it should be immune from challenge. Like we have, the United States is now taking India to the World Trade Organization because they're providing subsidies and sort of local content requirements to their solar industry. Like that is ridiculous. That is insane. Like, of course, it's absolutely critical that India, convert to solar. And to build support for that in their country, they want to create local jobs and use local investment. And for the U.S. to attack that through trade agreements, makes no sense. And so a safe harbor would be a way of ensuring those types of attacks, like the attack on the Ontario Green Energy Act from the Europeans and the Japanese, which was successful under the WTO and led to basically the dismantling of the local content requirements in that. Also, a huge issue is just transition for affected workers and communities.
If Canada wants to reduce carbon, right, let's retrofit buildings, let's put the whole government fleet on natural gas, let's provide money for community power projects, right? Mm-hmm. But putting a tax on gasoline that Joe Lunch Pail pays, right, is a non-starter. And you look at all the backlash we've had on this in Canada, you know. Now you got Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and it's an issue for right-wing populists to get all over top of. And, you know, I don't see this like benefiting the middle class, raising my price of gasoline, where in Vancouver we're already paying $1.61 a liter here this week. You know, is a non-starter, right? So I honestly think that if we want to reduce carbon, let's reduce carbon. But the carbon tax, in my opinion, total non-starter, kryptonite for the left. You know, this is an issue that we're getting killed on. And we haven't been able to sell this. Like I said, for my members, they just look at this as, you know,
What union?
cash grab. It's a cash grab.
No, but which union do you represent?
Construction, maintenance, and allied workers.
If we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have to do it directly. And part of the attraction of carbon taxes to it's not just the left. It's actually to economists. You know, is they want to do things through market mechanisms and market signals. They don't want to, you know, intervene directly in the economy at all. And I mean, for a carbon tax to be effective, it would have to be, you know, sort of on its own. In changing people's behavior, it would have to be about $200 a ton.
Like, there's been no reduction in carbon. It's just that we pay more per liter of gasoline.
Yeah. And again, this is getting a little bit outside my area of expertise, but I am extremely skeptical of carbon trading schemes, which I think are gamed, and just again, that's another way to put a price on carbon that's promoted by a lot of economists as a kind of a non-interventionist way to address climate change. But again, it's going to be so slow that we'll all be baked by the time it works. So I agree with all the things you said. What we should be doing is renovations. We should be replacing coal-fired plants. We should be keeping a lot of fossil fuels in the ground where they belong and putting people to work in other places. It's as I mentioned, just transition for affected workers and communities in places like Fort McMurray and other towns that are completely dependent on that industry have to be a big part of it. Like, we have to. I think if people feel we're sharing the burden fairly, but I do think there are ways to design carbon taxes that they create, that they lessen the impact on more vulnerable groups like low-income people, and that the revenues are used for direct job creation for the kinds of projects and others that you talked about. So I think they're part of the mix. But there's no way that either just carbon taxes or just carbon trading schemes, in my opinion, like just these so-called market mechanisms can do it. We need direct public investment on a massive scale to get through this period that's now. It's like 10 years to turn this thing around. And there's no time there's no time to lose in economic experiments, and for trade, looking at trade deals again, like the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. It's not surprising because Trump thinks that climate change is a hoax, but it's like a big fail on that issue. Anybody else want to?
I've heard you say a couple times direct public investment. Most of us as taxpayers are tired of our money being spent for corporations to make even more money.
Right.
So you keep saying direct public investment. I mean, why would we want to keep putting money into said oil company for them just to turn around and not do anything anyway?
Well, no, we invest in public works. I mean, you could look at, the American Recovery Act, like Obama's sort of response to in the aftermath of the financial crisis. I mean, you can criticize that on some levels.
I've often felt that for climate change, I think it's an important issue to everybody. I think a lot of people feel it as an important issue, but I don't think there's concrete ways where we can express that. I think we need better answers, better actions than elect better leaders, because I don't know about your provinces, but we're really shitty about doing that. So I think we need like a list of here's 5 things, choose 3. This is what will make a tangible impact, but we need that list.
Yeah.
I think people are willing to make that choice. They just need to be given the knowledge of what choices they need to make that they can then balance in their life and start doing that. So I think we just always talk about this amorphous climate change. Oh my God, it's going to happen in 12 years. Well, it's still 12. What's happening in 12 years? What can I do to stop that? I think we need to really say, do this, do this, do this. Don't just pay more at the pump unless it's funding something very particular. But we need that guidance to action.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is out there if you look for it. Like our British Columbia office at CCPA has been very active, and there's a lot of like good ideas for what can be done. I mean, I saw someone. I was a British climate scientist. Last night I watched an interview with him, and he was talking about a new Marshall Plan. Like the Marshall Plan was the plan to rebuild Europe after it was destroyed during World War II.
But that goes back to elect better politicians.
Yeah, tell me about it. we need better politicians and we need a better business class too.
It's pretty grim right now all around.
It is, and it's easy. It's easy to be discouraged by that. But again, like unions and working people have always played a key role in animating, impressing.
Then that needs to be our message.
Yeah,
like our message is, if climate change is important to you, you got to elect people who will deal with it, and like that's got to be. You just can't talk about the doom and gloom of it. You got to talk about the concrete action you can take.
Absolutely.
If it's like, don't eat any more beef because that's really bad or whatever, like, I don't care as long as this will help and you can choose to do it, and then you're making a choice of whether it's important enough to you. Yeah.
Did anybody know NAFTA II was coming? Did the government say this and this and this and this is what we're going to go for in NAFTA II? Or did they have secret agreements? Here's the document, live with it. Right? Nobody ran on NAFTA II, on a European free trade agreement, on an Asian trade agreement. Nobody ran on those. But they're going to decide, and it's going to affect you right down to the municipality with some things in these agreements. And you have absolutely no say. So better politicians.
Jan?
You don't even know what you're voting for.
Put every government vehicle on natural gas or electric, right? Those are real easy, concrete steps for us to do. I just don't understand why we're not doing
That a politician can take.
Right.
What can we do? Because this is important to me and my family.
So if we really want to do something about it, what we got to do, brother, is we got to push those politicians to do those things.
Okay, I saw
Yeah,
one hand.
that's
I saw
a
one hand
challenge.
at the back, and we. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've dealt with lots of environmentalists, and we did the long-term energy plan on Charlottetown. And I struggle, I think, with it because I look at it, I think the number one concern is poverty. I don't know how you deal with the environment till you straighten out poverty. And, and when I look at that as priorities for politicians, I think that's number one. You can look at saving the tree, but if there's a a kid or a family that's starving, you know, I think you got to look after the family. That's the short-term piece, and the long-term game is the environment. But
I mean, the last point I was going to make here is what we need is, you call it a Marshall Plan, you could call it a Green New Deal. I mean, FDR, Roosevelt in the 30s came around to the position that there had to be, massive public investment to address the Depression, and that's how they pulled themselves out of it. I mean, if we could build that same consensus about how to tackle the issue of climate change and get, buy-in to all these very specific projects that we've talked about, and to mobilize the public investment, which people have estimated it's not huge. It's like a couple of percentage points of global GDP to avert climate change that will be far more costly. I don't want to get into the climate porn, as they call it, but like global coastal cities being inundated, agricultural bread baskets no longer producing things. I mean, the costs of those are stratospheric, whereas still, the costs of retrofitting buildings, making electrification of the transportation system viable, all those things, those are still manageable costs. Whereas if we let this thing get out of control, the costs won't be manageable.
And who works in Fort McMurray? Who are the workers in Fort McMurray? Let me tell you who the workers are. They're fishermen who can't fish anymore. They're workers from Ontario who used to work in factories who had union jobs, right? Okay. They're loggers and sawmill workers from British Columbia that's seen their pulp mill or sawmill go down. Okay.
There are a lot of our neighbors
right.
around here.
So they're people who are refugees basically from other industries. Yeah. And when people start talking about a just transition for the workers in Fort McMurray, you wonder why people get the hair on the back of their neck up. It's because they were in industries that were, that they were told that
reliable.
So
we haven't done.
So we've done a shitty job
for decades.
Right.
We haven't done that for decades. Yeah.
So you wonder why people are so opposed in Fort McMurray to anything that reduces the oil sands, because they look at this as this is the last opportunity for a guy with a grade 12 education to make $150,000 a year, and that's what it comes down to, right? Mm-hmm. So we got to change the language on that one. I mean, look, nobody in Fort McMurray is going, hey, destroy the earth, okay? Whenever I go up there, everybody agrees there are no jobs on a dead planet, that's not a hard sell, even for Fort McMurray oil workers. But
corporations make all the decisions, workers and communities bear the brunt, and the devil take the hindmost. So yeah, we somehow have to restore, and unions are a big part of that, because you're collective institutions, you stand together. We have to restore this sense that, we're in this together, and that we need to address our problems together and share the benefits, share the work and the benefits much more fairly. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that's a big challenge, as one of the brothers said. Yeah, don't we have to address some of these other challenges like poverty or inequality first? No. I think there's an opportunity, and climate change, I think, presents a focal point for us to do all those things together. That would be my hopeful hopeful take on it. It's just such a huge threat that I think it focuses the mind and calls out for collective action. I'm going to talk a little bit now about another important part, another big failure of our current trade model. And as I referred to earlier, I mean, one of the sort of illustrations of this around, the messed up food system that's been created is that about 2 million Mexicans, mostly small corn farmers, were forced off the land during the NAFTA era by imports of cheap, some would argue, subsidized U.S. corn, controlled again by a handful of corporations like Cargill and others. So, again, stepping back, like what kinds of trade rules and trade systems do we need that can respect the rights and promote the livelihoods of primary producers? Especially in a place like Mexico, it's about accommodating local control of food systems and markets. I mean, there's always going to be trade in agriculture, but it can't just be about the Cargills and the Monsantos of the world. We need a system that creates some allowances for small producers. I think our supply management system is a good example of that. It's a planned system. We match production we match production to domestic consumption. And we share that out among farmers. We don't dump our products in international markets. It's in some ways the antithesis of a free market system. And if you look out into the global free market, I mean, farmers are dumping milk all over the world. It's like a roller coaster. Suicides and untold anguish, say, in the dairy market in particular. There's overproduction now in Europe. The world price of milk is a dumping price, and we're kind of this model of stability in the system. But every trade deal, actually since the WTO, has taken a chunk of our market. We had a talk from somebody from the Dairy Farmers of Canada, and they've added it all up. It comes to 18, and the USMCA took another chunk, or will take another chunk, comes to 18% of the dairy market in Canada when you add up WTO, CETA, CPTPP, and now NAFTA II. And at a certain point, people start to look around, especially people who paid a lot of money for quota, and the system, starts to just not look viable anymore. And I think it would be it's a terrible thing if that system gets destroyed. We have had, Ryan and I were chatting in the break. A lot of people don't realize that fisheries in Canada, the small fisheries, take the lobster fishery in Atlantic Canada. We have regulations in place that we put in place in the 1960s and are built up that says, that processors can't own licenses. We have limited entry with a limited number of traps in the lobster fishery. We have the owner-operator principle. So you have to, you don't get a license if you don't own the boat, and you can't accumulate licenses. That system has spread the benefits of the lobster fishery throughout the communities. Like, it's a healthy sector of our economy. And it's all that regulation is it's invisible to anyone unless you work in the fisheries. And every time the processors come after it, you'll see them, out in the streets. But yeah, we need. These are, I would say, actually existing alternatives. Let's put it like that in the food system that we can learn from. There are problems with both. There are a few problems with supply management, but they're good systems, and they show that they're Canadian innovations too, and they show that we can organize our food systems in different ways that aren't totally dominated by a handful of corporations, which is what would have happened in all these areas, in both these areas, if we hadn't taken deliberate policy choices to support a more diversified industry that provides greater benefits to communities.
And as I was growing up, we'd always see certain newspapers in the lunchrooms and that on the construction sites, and it would be like the Toronto Suns or whatever, a non-union paper. And here we have some of our members supporting a non-union kind of environment and not promoting a union environment. So sometimes we're pretty hypocritical here too.
I've noticed in the last month or so on the milk bags in Ontario, it says local milk in advance of the free trade agreement, the new NAFTA II, right? And I think even if milk comes in and it becomes cheaper, but you've got your growth hormone in it from the States potentially, you've got antibiotics in it potentially, right? As we were talking before, you stated the Canadian government won't put on products, this contains growth hormone, right? They won't
label it.
They won't label it. But continue to buy locally. I would suggest, if you can, in some way, tell your members, buy locally. Because when this starts, they will be having cheaper cheese, they will be having cheaper stuff until they get the market share, and then it'll rise up, and the Canadian producer will suffer.
People should make intelligent consumer choices and buy locally. And in the case of milk, you can look for the Dairy Farmers of Canada logo, which is now on milk, and that shows that it's locally produced milk without antibiotics or the growth hormone RBST, which you can't know about industrial products because already we have U.S. milk being incorporated into some forms of yogurt and ice cream and other industrial products or stuff that you might get, like an ice cream cone at a fast food chain or something like that. But I just want to say, we need to defend the system because we can't do it as consumers. It's important that we make smart choices, but again, we do need these support networks in place. Regulation has a bad name, but we need these support networks in place, like supply management, like owner-operator in the fisheries, like fleet separation. And it's so much better to defend those and let people know how upset you are. I mean, it's like collective bargaining, You can't say to workers, oh yeah, you have to make individual choices, don't work for a shitty employer, blah, blah, blah. No, we have to defend, the structure of our labor law, and improve it. Just extrapolate those lessons to other sectors. And sometimes if you don't work in a sector, you don't understand that sometimes it's policy choices that have been made, often many years ago, that have contributed to the success of those industries.
I read a stat a while ago that if the ferries to Newfoundland and Labrador, for example, if they went out, we would have a food supply that would last 4 to 10 days before you'd see shelves become empty or whatever. So, and the real fear at home with the dairy industry is that with supply management gone, and then the flooding in of cheaper cheese, cheaper milk from elsewhere, it will kill our dairy industry. It will kill. It's one thing to say buy local, but it's got to be local and competitive. And if it's not competitive, because Pepsi, for example, a 2-liter Pepsi is 99 cents versus $2.99 for milk. People buy the cheaper
It's got to
alternative.
be there.
It's got to
There's
be
a
there.
choice. If you don't have local farmers.
But is supply management gone under NAFTA II?
No, it's not gone.
It's called the Class 7 pricing system, but it was an attempt basically to sell skim milk and skim milk products at a price that was competitive with U.S. prices. It's a long story, but it was a way to deal with the credible distortions in our dairy system, because the U.S. can ship in it's called diafiltered milk. Basically, it's just a highly condensed milk product that can be used to produce yogurt or ice cream or any other industrial food product, or like the freezies or the soft ice cream that you get in fast food outlets. So that stuff enters through kind of a loophole. It enters Canada duty free, and it takes up a big part of our market. So we have a growing market for butter and cheeses and so on, and our butter is actually cheaper than butter in the U.S. But we don't have an outlet for our skim milk, and you can't produce butter without producing skim milk, right? You can't produce the butter fats without producing the rest of it too. It got to the point a couple of years ago where people were spilling, they're just dumping their skim milk. So they designed a system that was meant to deal with this issue, which is a trade-related issue of this industrial product coming in over the border. That was the so-called Class 7 system. And, it's gone now. The Americans got rid of it. So supply management is going to be put under further strain by this agreement. So hopefully it will survive, but I can tell you for a fact that a lot of supply managed producers are going to take a big hit, to their income, and some of them, especially those who've made big investments in quota recently, are probably going to face a very difficult future.
If you're on a limited income and you want to provide cheese for your family, you're going to buy the cheapest cheese.
Well, I just want to say American milk is not necessarily cheaper. As I said, our butter and cheese is price competitive with the U.S.
and it's cheaper than New Zealand and Australia, which are totally deregulated markets. Now, fluid milk,
Their cheese is way cheaper in the U.S. It's way cheaper.
Well, okay. The price comparisons I've seen are not the same, but also you have to be.
We live by the border.
But okay, you have to be careful what you're comparing to. If you want to buy hormone-free, antibiotic-free milk in the United States, you basically have to buy organic milk. Our whole system produces antibiotic, hormone-free milk at a cheaper average price last year than U.S. Hormone-free antibiotic milk. So if you're comparing like product to like product, our products are competitive. And again, it changes. It changes because of the exchange rate, a lot of other things. But I don't, and I don't accept that you can through a system like supply management. That's what I said. Structure. You can influence people's choices, and if you throw it completely open, yeah, of course, people will likely choose the cheapest product. But if you explain to people that you can design a system that keeps farmers on the land, produces a safe product that's available to all consumers, you'll find people support it. And poll after poll shows that not only rural Canadians,
but urban Canadians strongly, overwhelmingly, like up high 70% support the supply management system and think we should defend it. So again, I think we can and we do better in many cases. We're coming up to noon. I have one more. I can keep my streak of. I was going to talk about intellectual property rights. I know you probably that would fit into Leo's discussion. I'll just briefly tell you. Okay, this graph shows pharmaceutical spending since NAFTA entered into force, and Canadians spend more on drugs per capita than anybody in the world except Americans. We're the second most expensive system. A lot of that has to do with our, industry-friendly intellectual property rules. A lot of them imposed on us through trade agreements. Now, the outcome in the NAFTA 2.0 was a bad outcome on this. We agreed to longer periods of monopoly protection. I won't go into all the details, but for biologic drugs, for example, and I heard a bit of your discussion, these are like very fast-growing segment of the market, which are seen as a profit center for pharma. We went from 8 years of what's called data protection to 10 years. Now, I think what we have to compare it to is, when the elder Trudeau, Pierre, was Prime Minister, after 7 years of monopoly protection for pharmaceuticals, you could have what was called compulsory licensing. So if a drug, if the community felt a drug was necessary to fight an urgent health problem or to keep costs down in the system, after 7 years of market exclusivity, you could produce that, you could open that drug to generic competition. And, the results are, we got rid of that in the original Canada-US Free Trade Agreement as kind of a side deal. And, the results are plain to see. We're kind of like, the frog that is boiling in the water as it's gradually increased. We spend far too much on drugs in this country, and the reason is entirely it's a legal system of monopoly protection that's been designed by Big Pharma for Big Pharma. They are insatiable, and trade agreements are a major way that they ratchet it up, and they've done it again. Again, I think from an alternative point of view, we should be talking about just really redesigning our whole intellectual property system from the start, from the ground up. It's just really, it's become a hindrance to innovation. It's become a way, especially access to medicines, to just gouge people. And I'll just close by saying the impacts in Mexico are going to be far more extreme than the impacts in Canada. They're going from 0 to 10 on biologic drugs. They have no required protection at all. They don't have patent term extensions that we've now had in place for since the European deal. So. And in a country, where I saw a figure, 30 or 40% of the population live on $5.50 US a day, they are not going to be able to afford access to medicines, and their health system won't either. So this is a matter of life and death there. And again, but for us, it's just unfortunately more of the same. I think I'll stop there, folks. I think it's time.
Thank you, Scott. Is there any questions for Scott? I know lunch is ready, but if you have any questions right now would be a good time to ask. If there isn't, I'd like to thank Scott very much for taking time out of the day. We have a gift for you. And we have a gift for CCP. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And join us for lunch.
Okay, I'll do that. We can continue our discussions. I'm glad we could make it a little more open and back and forth. 2 hours is a long time to just sit and listen to a speaker. So thanks,
Thank you very
thanks a lot.
much. Thank you very much.